You know, now the United States, we have an airplane called the Supersonic Concorde. That airplane can fly from England or France to the United States in 3 hours. It's called Mach 2, 1,300 miles an hour. But people in America aren't happy. They aren't satisfied. Many businessmen, government people, would like to fly in 1 hour. You know, if we could fly to Paris or London in 1 hour, we could live there and work here and fly back and forth. It'd be much faster, and we could share our ideas better with France and England and the United States. So, the government decided to give a lot of money to the industry to investigate and try to develop a better airplane than the Concorde. That required the industry many years, 10, 12 years to work, and finally they succeeded. They were ready on May 1st, 1994. The new airplane was called the SSCF-4, really ultrasonic airplane. It could get there in 1 hour. It was real quick. So came the important day, May 1st, 1994. The people all flocked to New York, the JFK airport. There were newspaper writers, radio reporters, TV people, and businessmen, high government officials. They all flocked there waiting for that new airplane to take off. President Jackson, the United States President, was sitting in the Oval Room of the White House with his cabinet, sitting around the table watching a large television screen, and workers in different factories and hospitals, schools, and they suspended work just to watch the television to see the ultrasonic plane take off. All over the United States and the world, they were watching their televisions, and it was ready. Then all of a sudden it roared, and the engines opened to 174,000 pounds of thrust and started to take off. In a few seconds, it hit the sound barrier. And once it struck it, boom, the sound barrier, that sonic boom, had never been up to that level before. The people all across the United States heard the sonic boom, and they were still watching the television and watching that white cloud there. And in the White House, the President Graves, smiled and said to the cabinet members, "It seems our airplane has succeeded beautifully in this experiment." And he was talking, and the cabinet was looking at the President with a real puzzled look on their face. And again, he says, "Our experiment has succeeded, right?" And the cabinet looked around, and the Secretary of Health stood up and said, "Excuse me, Mr. President, we can't understand you." The President looked and saw his lips moving, but he couldn't understand him. And the other cabinet members looked around and looked at each other and started talking, and no one could understand each other. So they picked up a phone, and there was no sound on the phone. And they were wondering. So the Secretary wrote a note to the President, "It seems we have temporarily lost our hearing from the sonic boom, and it's made us temporarily deaf. Let's call the White House physician." They were sitting around waiting, and in the U.S. Senate, the Vice President was calling a meeting to order, and all the senators couldn't understand a thing. The senators started talking to each other, and they couldn't understand each other, and they became frightened. It became a scene of panic. Everybody was afraid, making gestures. They didn't know what to do. Later, they got a telex from the U.S. Surgeon General. He called and he said that all men and women and children in the United States have become completely deaf from the sonic boom. Everyone was shocked. So it happened in our nation, became a nation of deaf people. No hearing people were left. Everyone was deaf. The stores had to buy large pads of paper, and people were going in and writing back and forth. Radio business just completely collapsed. Television industry was real depressed because people couldn't understand anything. Phone operators all day long were just sitting back because there were no phone calls being made. They were just sitting back drinking coffee. Occasionally they would have a telephone call through TTY and they'd know that person. Oh, a deaf person. But it was a real quiet country. So the people were sitting around, but the president of the National Association of the Deaf called his board members, and they called a meeting in Washington, D.C. The NAD board all flew in, and they discussed the problem. They said, maybe we better have a meeting with the White House and help our country. Sure enough, they sent a telegram to the President of the United States, and President Graves got it, and he saw that they would be willing to help us. And so, oh, we've been deaf all our lives, and maybe you're awkward right now, but we can help you. So the cabinet was shown the telegram, and so the NAD board was invited to the White House to meet with the President, Graves, and his cabinet. And they were in awe. They saw the sign language going on, and now the hearing had become deaf, and they were writing back and forth to each other. They had to write fast with notes back and forth, and they agreed. And the president announced that we'll set up a national program of sign language. And he picked up an expert to direct all the public schools and all the colleges, and they were required to learn sign language throughout the country. And many deaf people got fine jobs. Even some hearing people who had become deaf were teaching sign language. And all over the United States they were signing. Car radios were removed and replaced with television sets. Car horns were removed, and lights, like on fire engines, were put on there. And people were deaf. It was a deaf world. And now it came time for the political campaigns. Of course, the people who had long since been deaf were very fluent in signing, and other recently deafened people were clumsy in their signing, and they lost all their elections. And Governor of Montana and Governor of Maryland, and deaf people were becoming mayors. And finally, a campaign and election, Tim O'Hara, the president of the NAD, had run for president of the United States. And he just took off. He won easily. And that's how we got our first deaf president of the United States.
We all know that the United States is a free country today. And we also know that more than 200 years ago, we fought for our independence against England. But do you know how it really began? Do you know how deaf people helped in the struggle to have freedom in America? Do you? Let me tell you about it. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was born in Martha's Vineyard in 1730. Martha's Vineyard is near Boston, Massachusetts. His name was Silence Dogood. This is his name sign. Well, Martha's Vineyard had many more deaf people than other places. In the general population, There were usually about 1 out of every 1,000 people who were deaf. But in Martha's Vineyard, 1 out of every 155 people were deaf. So proportionally, it was very different. You can see that there were a lot of deaf people there, and that deafness was accepted as a normality. Everyone could communicate with each other by using total communication, and people were skilled signers. There were no communication problems. During that period, many years ago, when my great-grandfather was born, the United States was not a country yet, but it was 13 colonies living under England's rule. You may be familiar with a famous man who lived at that time. I'm sure you know Ben Franklin. He was a famous inventor, writer, printer, scientist, and politician. He and my grandfather met way back, and he was fascinated with my grandfather. They wrote notes back and forth. Then he asked Silas Dogood to work for him. Now, Ben Franklin did not have such a good education when he was a child. But there he was writing notes back and forth, and as time went on, he developed good writing skills and began writing articles for newspapers. But he didn't think that he should use his own name. He didn't think that was appropriate, since no one knew him. So he used the name Dogood as his pen name. Anyway, my grandfather worked for him in his print shop at his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Ben Franklin communicated with many deaf people by writing notes back and forth, and he ended up hiring many of them. He decided that writing notes between people was great, and he came up with a brilliant idea. Why not have a post office? And that's the story of how the post office first started in the United States. The sending of letters between and among people started from writing notes back and forth with deaf people. At that time, we were under England's rule. We had no voice in any of the decision-making procedures in the government. Yet, remember that they charged us taxes and things like that. We did not take to that very well, so they sent the British military over to keep an eye on us, to make sure that we did not rebel or that we didn't put up a fight, to keep things calm. They even stood guard with guns. Well, one day in Boston in 1770, someone called to another person, but failed to get their attention. So he threw a rock into the crowd, and the British started shooting into the crowd. 3 citizens were killed, and 7 people were wounded. The news was gotten to Ben Franklin immediately. He couldn't believe what was happening, and he wanted the news printed right away about the British soldiers killing our people. He was in such a hurry that he didn't have time to write down his message, so he spoke to the deaf printer, who had to lip read. He said, 3 killed, 7 wounded. The printer was shocked and quickly printed in big letters for the headlines, 3,700 people were killed in the Boston Massacre. And those were the headlines that were distributed to everyone. When Ben Franklin came and saw the paper, he said, "Oh, no, that's wrong. I said 3 were killed, not 3,700. That deaf printer is fired." But people all over the country were reading the same headlines and getting angry. Remember that before this happened, people said, "So what? We have to pay some taxes. That's okay." But when this happened, they were mad, and they wanted to have their independence from England. So when this happened, the people joined together, and they met at the print shop, and they let Ben Franklin know that he was right, and that they should all join together and fight and work together. Then all the people left. Ben Franklin said, "This is great," and told the deaf printer not to say anything about the mistake, because he wanted the people to join together anyway. But the deaf printer said, "Hold on a minute. The next time, we have to have clearer communication between the 2 of us, so why don't you learn sign language?" Ben Franklin agreed to that and started learning, but he was having a hard time forming the signs correctly because it was so cold. So he invented the pot-belly stove. a wood-burning stove which is vented, allowing the smoke to escape. And that was how they kept warm. That's why it was invented. The real reason was to keep your hands warm while signing. Then more and more people began talking with each other by using fingerspelling or just by speaking in English in public about what was going on with the British. British soldiers began to complain about this and announced that it was illegal to assemble in public and to talk. But you know that you can't stop deaf people from talking and chatting on the street corners. So they went ahead with what they were doing, and they ignored the announcement by talking whenever they wanted to. There was talk going around about taxes that were to be increased, and they said that they would start taxing the tea. People were really opposed to this, and they became angrier about the taxes going up and about the fact that they had no voice in the matter. Complaints were made because it was taxation without representation. If they wanted to tax people, fine, but the people should be able to vote, either in support or in opposition. That was their right. So it was decided that the people would dress up like Indians and sneak onto the British ship and throw all of the boxes of tea overboard into the Boston harbor. So they went ahead with what they planned, and that was what really started the deaf people and the hearing people working together. That incident caused people to look up to the people who lived in Boston for their courage and their ability to rebel against the British. And that relates directly to Congress declaring war against England. Ben Franklin heard about this decision for America to fight to gain its freedom, and he immediately ran to his print shop, even though it was late at night and it was rainy and it was cold out. He wanted to get the headlines printed to say, "America at war against England." That's what he wanted. He got there, but he couldn't find his key to get in. He may have lost it or something, but he remembered that his deaf assistant had a key. So he went over to his home, and even though it was late on a dark and rainy night, he banged on the door, but there was no response. Remember that at that time there were no doorbells or flashing lights for deaf people. So Ben Franklin was stuck. He didn't know what to do. He had to get that key so that he could get into his print shop. He saw a light up on the second floor, and that meant that they were in bed, but they probably weren't asleep yet. That gave him an idea. Yes, he would get a kite, a red kite, a big, red, bright kite. And he did just that, and he flew it in front of the man's window. Then the deaf man stuck his head out the window and said, "Ben, what are you doing? What do you want? It's midnight." Ben said, struggling with his signs, "I need the key." See, they were able to communicate by then. The deaf man said that he had the key, but that he didn't want to go all the way downstairs to hand it to him. So he told Ben Franklin to bring the kite closer to the window and that he would tie the key to the string. Still struggling with his signs, Ben agreed. The man started tying the key to the string, when just at that moment, above the clouds, lightning struck the key. Ben Franklin, who was holding the kite string, cried, "I found electricity!" But we know that it was really the deaf man's idea. Okay, back to the war. People really communicated well with each other. You know how fast news travels through the deaf grapevine, don't you? Well, they were good at passing the news around about what was happening in the war between America and England, and the soldiers became known as Minutemen. That means that the soldiers and the communicators became good at passing the news, and that hearing and deaf people worked together. Yes, Paul Revere was probably the best known Minuteman. He rode his horse from town to town, letting people know what was going on. They knew that that night the British would come, and they wanted to prevent that because they didn't have enough guns, they didn't have enough bullets, and they didn't have enough cannons. But they didn't know how to protect themselves since they didn't have enough soldiers. The British had plenty of soldiers. We asked ourselves where the best place to protect ourselves was. We didn't know how the British would come. We didn't know if they would come by sea or by land. It just wasn't known. But Paul Revere said that it didn't matter because he would let the people know, and then they would know where the best place to defend themselves from was. That was agreed upon. And at that time, you have to remember that the church had a large bell, but Paul Revere could not hear anything. He was deaf. So that's how they changed from using bells to using lights. They used 1 candle if by sea and 2 if by land. That was how Paul Revere could see to know what was happening, and then he could ride and warn the people, and the Minutemen could protect the people. No one stole any guns or bullets, and no one died in that battle. He did a wonderful job. If you go to Concord, Massachusetts, today, you will see a famous statue of the deaf Minutemen posed with their guns in their arms. The person who did that sculpture was Daniel Chester French. This is a little off the point, but I wanted you to know that the same sculptor, French, did the statue of Gallaudet and the little girl sitting with him, Alice, showing the configurations of the letters A in sign language. That was the same man. He also did the famous statue of Abraham Lincoln that sits in the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington, D.C. If you go to look at the statue of Lincoln, you will see that his hands are carved in the shape of his initials in sign language. You will see an A and an L. That, the Lincoln statue, the Gallaudet statue, and the Minutemen statue shows that they are all related to deafness. Okay, now, back to the war. The famous Battle of Bunker Hill was fought in 1775. I think you know about that battle. At that time, we still had problems. We didn't have enough guns, or enough bullets, or enough soldiers. We only had 1,500 American soldiers, and they were all unexperienced. Many were farmers or printers or other kinds of people, and they were fighting against 3,000 British soldiers. The British were all experienced, trained soldiers who marched together. So we were nervous during that time, that we were watching and we were waiting for them to attack. But there was no attack for a long time, and the deaf people started talking with each other. Well, before they knew it, the British were almost on top of them, but immediately they started shooting, and that really impressed the general. That was General Gage. He was very impressed at how the deaf people had saved bullets. He said, "From now on, rule number 1, you do not fire until you see the whites of the enemy's eyes." And that became a rule. Then Thomas Jefferson came to Boston to see what was going on. He talked to people about how he wanted to see this country become free once and for all. But he didn't know any sign language, and he and the deaf people had a hard time understanding one another. So finally he had to write down what he wanted to say, and that became the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence. That famous piece of paper was really written for deaf people. It was written in 1776. We kept on fighting with England, and we won another battle in 1776. That was the Battle of Saratoga. People were very happy, but puzzled when they saw that Ben Franklin didn't seem happy. He moped around, and people asked him why he wasn't happy that the Battle of Saratoga had been won. Ben said that he was very worried about the future and what would happen to all the people because there were only a few guns left, bullets were running out, and the cannons were no good anymore, and soldiers were dying. There was just not enough. Help was needed badly to win this war. He had said that there had been trips made to France, but, well, the people said, "Go on, but what?" He said, "Well, we can't communicate with the French." Well, my great-great-great-grandfather said that he would go and that he could help with communication, that he was good at helping with communication among other deaf people in different countries. Ben Franklin said, well, why not? They needed some kind of help. So they sailed to France. They met with the French representatives, and they met with deaf people there. And my great-great-great-grandfather communicated in whatever ways he could with the deaf Frenchman, who then told the French officials what he had said. They were happy to help. They had just not understood what the Americans had wanted before. Now they helped, and they said that they would send money and supplies and soldiers, and they did that. Later, they went to Spain, and they talked with the advisors to the king. The king said that he would be happy to help in fighting the war against England in Europe. Well, England became weaker and weaker, and the rest of the story is history. We know who won the war. We know that we won our freedom. But the question is, could we have become a free country, the United States of America, without the help of deaf people?